Hi, and welcome to Legislative and Economic Foundations, one of our subtopics for July 1st through July 7th this week. My name is Shelby, and I will be presenting alone, but excited to get into this with y'all. Uh, we are going to be taking a pretty large scale view of legislative and economic foundations. As you all know, this is a large and complex topic, just like all of our topics are. And so I want us to really focus on how can we as adult educators understand how legislative and economic foundations influence the outcomes that we see in our communities, in those we're providing services to, or in our own economies, large and small, and how different ideologies, different decision makers all come together to produce these results. And for some of us, that may impact us in the classroom. And for others, it may just be something that we see in the communities we live, work, and play in. So we'll be looking really at that macro view and trying to think through how can we spot trends, how can we identify motivations, and how can we be better informed around legislative and economic foundations. So I'm going to do a quick overview. Certainly will not cover everything, but trying to pull out and spotlight some of the ways in which economic beliefs and ideologies inform legislative outcomes and how that then trickles down into the decisions that we see in our communities. Um, I want to take a moment just to really recognize all that goes into legislative and economic decisions. So it's not that these things live just in our textbooks. It's not that they arise out of nowhere. All of the legislative priorities, acts, budgeted things that we see are coming out of the context in which we live. This includes demographic changes, so aging populations, birth rates, immigration and emigration within the United States and to and from the United States, economic shifts, the Great Depression, World War II, globalization in the 80s, the rise of technology after that, manufacturing shifting from being really hyper American to overseas, ideological changes, progressivism, conservatism, individualism, populism, all of these pieces that we all know exist within our political landscape. Political pressures, so pressures on administrations, executives, legislators to respond to some economic shifts, demographic needs, ideological changes, or to pass policy that gives them a win while they're in office. And then, of course, major events, wars, um, other economic events. We mentioned the Depression, elections sometimes, all of this can impact workforce education approaches. And as you'll see when we walk through the timeline briefly, the timeline, when you zoom out, it could just be a timeline of major events in the United States. And that's not by coincidence. All that's happening around us ends up influencing workforce education policy, and then that in turn influences the world that we see ourselves in. My learning objectives that I hope you'll join me in this week are first to identify the underlying philosophy or economic assumptions behind at least one policy act in workforce development and education, to analyze how values, beliefs, and legislative priorities impact outcomes for workforce education and development, and then to create a mock policy plan to address a workforce education scenario. So you will be invited to do each of these things and hopefully feel confident doing these things in the future as a result of our time together. Before we get into the timeline, I just want to sort of lay the pathway for who are the decision makers, like who does decide legislative things, who's involved in that, and how do those decisions then trickle down into programs that we see in front of us. We can either take a top-down or a bottom-up approach. If we're going to start with sort of a top-down approach, we can think about Congress and the president as those first movement makers who are developing and revising workforce education funding programs in response to economic, political, and citizen needs. So these are the folks that are, with the help from very smart folks and their advisors, crafting the budget that ends up getting passed to different departments and state to put into place programming for education and workforce development. One of the groups that they're passing this funding along to are federal departments. And boy, are there a lot of them that receive funding to provide workforce education and training. It includes education, labor, health and human services, energy, homeland security, State Department, and others. So federal departments are receiving funding. So are states. So state legislators and governors will often also receive funding, and then they need to decide how that funding should be expended. Often they are either passing it along to state departments or selecting contractors and grantees to fulfill services, or deciding how state departments should select those contractors and grantees, or whether states should run services internally. So those state departments in your own state, they might include higher education, commerce, industry, labor, K-12, human services, and others. So these are also involved in decision making with that big chunk of money. It's getting filtered down through all of these levels of final two decision makers, industry partners. So this might include some of the contractors that are working to fulfill services for workforce education, nonprofits, sector leadership, others, and those that are maybe informing decisions as part of councils or advisory groups. And then, of course, the final decision maker are the citizens. This includes voters, right? So as citizens, we vote to put into place state legislators, governors, presidents, congressmen and women that impact how our workforce education is funded. We also have opportunities to serve on local advisory boards established in one of the acts, which we'll talk about next. So even though I just went through this top down, you can really see how it's also bottom up, right? As citizens, we are the first decision makers, and then also the beneficiaries of the decisions that have been made. Okay, let's jump into the timeline. This is not a timeline of everything, but just some major policy decisions that I think are quite interesting, and that you can kind of start to piece out some of the how some of those decision makers are responding to those factors we talked about earlier, from the Depression and wars and changing economies, and how they're deciding to put into paper some of these policy decisions to make sure that those final decision makers and beneficiaries, you, the citizens, are having access to education and training. So we're going to start 1913. The Department of Labor was formed. It was created to foster, promote, and develop the welfare of working people, to improve their working conditions, and to enhance their opportunities for profitable employment. Really rising from the tides of populism and progressivism, wanting to make sure that the middle class has opportunity to provide for themselves, their families, and that falls within the federal government's responsibility, before which maybe it wasn't seen as a fit there. In 1917, the Smith-Hughes Act was passed to provide funding for vocational education in high schools. Way back in 1862, the Morrill Land Grant Act was passed, which of course provided like technical funding for colleges and universities to provide technical education, agricultural education. But the Smith-Hughes Act takes that down into high school age students, signifying that they want a more educated workforce after high school. Then in 1933, on the heels of the Depression, the Wagner-Payzer Act is passed, written to connect job seekers to employers after sort of the dismantlement of the entire economy. Quickly on the heels of that, as you can imagine, there's a lot done during the Depression to sort of get the economy back on track. In 1935, the Works Progress Administration is providing jobs for those struggling to find employment. It's expanded and renamed in 1939 to employ workers and infrastructure development, which I think is an interesting piece when we think about all of the bridges, dams, highways, wastewater treatment plants, everything else that was built in the 40s and beyond. We know that cost a lot of money. It also cost money and time in training people to know how to build bridges, to understand how to engineer the dams, and then to make sure that the folks that are actually doing the work on the ground have the proper training that they need. So that's kind of an interesting, I think, piece to reflect on. Between 1935 and 1960, a lot happens. One notable thing that I didn't include here is that post-World War II, there's a lot of additional investment in basic literacy for adult education. In 1962, the Manpower Development and Training Act was passed, which provided federal funding for training and retaining of workers, and it later evolved to focus on low-income individuals. So we can see more here now, as the civil rights movement is building, how can we provide support for different segments of our population. After that, there's sort of these more rapid shifts as we watch different administrations seek to adapt to a rapidly changing economic and political landscape, as well as kind of put their own stamp on policies that are coming out. So in 1973, the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act replaces that MDTA Act, the MDTA, and it's providing job training and employment to assistance to low-income individuals and displaced workers. Then in 1982, the Job Training Partnership Act replaces the CETA, which expanded the scope of workforce development programs to include dislocated workers and other populations in need. As we can see, excuse me. As we can see, it's not that these are like being fully dismantled. Rather, it's a retooling, a shifting of the budget. Maybe one department gets a little bit more ownership over decision making. Maybe there's an expansion of funding or a contraction, but we're having these kind of more rapid shifts. In 1998, the Workforce Investment Act introduced this concept of a one-stop job approach and established local workforce investment boards. We can think of this as recognizing that the same people who are coming to get job training may also need some case management, may also need some food benefits, may also need help connecting with a job service provider. So instead of that person having to seek out 12 different agencies, is there a way for them to receive the services they need in a little bit more streamlined fashion? And then in 2014, WIA, that Workforce Investment Act, is replaced or transformed into WIOA, which is an acronym we know and see and we'll dig into a little bit this week. Strengthening partnerships with local agencies, employers, and workers, really trying to make sure that that communication between what skill sets and qualifications employers need is really quickly and directly matching the education and training that providers are offering. We can think about how rapidly the economy is changing and has changed in the last 30 to 40 years and how important some of those local partnerships and input continue to be. Okay, that was the quick and dirty timeline of some of the major pieces that have, of policy pieces that have ended up funding programming across the country. I want to take a look now at some of the different ideologies that inform these roles. We've touched on them, right? We looked at some populism or progressivism. We looked at maybe thinking a little bit about how during the civil rights movement, we're wanting to embed equity into our system. We're thinking about how maybe in the 80s and the 90s, there's some focus on neoliberalism and globalization and allowing the market to take a broader role in some of the education that we're providing. This is a scale that's been pulled from a couple of different texts that are sort of source cited on the last page. It's not a perfect spectrum, but I think for our approach, it can kind of help illustrate that balance between education being a social good in and of itself, that the government is responsible for offering and providing and making accessible and equitable, to something that maybe is a means to an ends for the economy to improve, which of course that improves hopefully the well-being of folks that are in the workforce, and something that the government does not need to take a very strong hand in. So if we start over here with a justice approach, decision makers that are taking a justice approach believe that the government not only should be involved in decision making, but that it is imperative for them to think about how workforce education can improve economic and individual outcomes for everyone, with an emphasis on those most impacted. So we're not just making somebody better at typing, we're connecting how their improvement in typing can lead to better individual outcomes, happier, healthier, stronger, more community-oriented, specifically looking at historically marginalized or oppressed populations. And recognizing that, or believing that, the government's role should be active in helping rebalance inequities in society. A welfare approach, again, emphasizes of the role of a centralized government in meeting the needs of citizens. It's maybe a little less active and aggressive in that justice approach, and simply saying it is the government's responsibility to help redirect resources when and where needed, to the extent that it makes sense within budget priorities. A neoliberal approach begins to minimize the government's role in programs and policy, placing responsibility on individuals, corporations, and the market. So instead of believing over here in the justice and welfare approaches that it's the government's absolute role and priority and prerogative, neoliberalism suggests, what is the least amount the government can do to support workforce education and development without tipping the scales or unnecessarily weighing or leaning too heavily, and instead letting the market do more of that work. And then on the other side of that would be free market capitalism, which of course is influenced by neoliberalism, but similar to welfare and the justice approach, it's just one more step to the extreme. So it's saying, in fact, we don't believe that the government should be intervening at all. We should rely on market forces to adapt to changing needs. And we want to minimize the amount of funding or budget that the government is expending in workforce education, because we believe the economy will take care of it. And that as soon as you put government funding, it's going to shift and tip the free market, which otherwise would function to the best interest of the workers and the economy. So we can see these ideologies at play in elections, in our current world. We can see them in policies. If we were to dig deeper into this timeline, you could kind of start to pull out some of those. We're going to use them to analyze in your next steps here, analyze a piece of policy in your own state, and then also to help build a policy plan from a scenario. So excited, I invite you to use this spectrum, or if there is a different ideology or economic ideology that you believe better matches your approach or how you might describe it, I invite you to use that as well. Okay, so your turn. Next, I'm going to invite you to find a statewide or regional policy, and you'll share that on a little Canva brainstorming board, and do a quick summary of that policy decision, either the assumptions or the values present, excuse me. And then you're going to build your own plan. I'll have a scenario shared below in the discussion thread, and you'll respond to it with your mock plan of how you would allocate those fundings, what ideologies you're influenced by, and how you would partner with different folks in that work. Sorry. And then you'll discuss your plans and ask at least one question of another student's plan. And then Saturday and Sunday, we're having our very own 2024 election. You will be all invited to vote on the plan you would like to support as a citizen of our made-up EDAsville. And then we'll, give the winner of the best plan a reigning rights for workforce education policymaking until the end of our course here. Okay, I'm excited for the rest of the week. Here are a few quick references. And other than that, excited to dig into it. Thanks, everyone.